Hey, JD.
Hey, good morning.
Hey, so good morning. Yeah, it's afternoon. That's the funny thing about Monday Matters. You know, it's Tuesday afternoon, but Monday does matter, right?
It does.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, JD, what is a fallen leader?
Fallen leader, I think it's easier just to sort of, we all have leaders that we know. It's people that we put our expectations in. You know, we put our hopes and dreams. We expect them to sort of be above the line because they're visionaries, and then they do something stupid and they fall.
Yeah.
And so they have this sort of fall from grace. So I think
Bill Cosby.
Bill Cosby, yep. It's where you portray something. So like Bill Cosby, you portray family values, right? Because that's what the Cosby Show was. It's like, this is what the perfect family is supposed to look like. You know, you're one of America's heroes. And then, boom, allegation, improper conduct, etc. You know, so
in
it's
prison.
In prison, yeah. It's hypocrisy. That's what, a fallen leader is. It's because leaders are visionaries. And when they do the exact opposite of what they preach, it devastates people.
Yeah, and especially when they hold a position that portrays some type of a moral authority of some kind, right? Some kind of higher standing than we typically would put on other people, like a plumber. And plumbers are great. I don't mean to take anything away, but if wow, that got weird. Anyway, yeah.
So why is this topic so pertinent to us? You know, we talked about it this week, and it was I thought it was something super, super pertinent. But why do you think it's so pertinent to the church and to those within the church?
I mean, you look at currently. I mean, it feels like there's scandal after scandal after scandal in the church, and I say the church. I'm talking about the Catholic Church, the Baptist Church, the Evangelical Church, kind of the church not totally at large, but in our culture, maybe it's the church. And so it's pertinent because if we don't say anything, it's almost like we just want to put it under the rug. We don't want to put it under the rug, but in some ways, what do you say? Because it's totally undefendable in any way. But and it's an embarrassing thing, but it's not me. So what do you do with that?
And a lot of this stuff is just starting to come to light. So one of my friends in seminary just recently talked about how they were leaving the faith. And I'm okay sharing this because it was a public post and whatnot. I'm not going to share names, but they said that they're going to leave the faith because one of their main reasons is going to seminary. I saw behind the curtain, because all these are pastors and professors. I saw behind the curtain, and there was just complete hypocrisy. And that's part, as church leaders, as pastors. And that's why I think this topic is so important for the church. We're saying something. What we say has substance. We're not comedians. Not that comedians don't have substance, but, we're not going up there just telling jokes. Like, we're talking about the truth.
Right.
We're talking about hope. And so
we're saying, follow me as I follow Christ, right?
Exactly. And so when we say something that has substance, and this person's reason for falling away from the faith is there was this deep-rooted hypocrisy in the church where pastors will say one thing, but then behind the scenes they act in a completely different way. And I know that that's a struggle with the church, or a reason for not going to the church, that I know a lot of people that are like that. And so that's why I think this topic is so pertinent, is we're past the point of sweeping all this stuff under the rug.
Yeah, sure.
Information is out there because of the internet. All these scandals. You can't keep them localized anymore. Everyone knows. And so like the Bible says, let's shine a light on it. Let's bring it out into the light. Let's not, just pretend like church hypocrisy and fallen leaders don't exist.
Yeah, and so it kind of helps me appreciate it when people say, I can't do organized religion, because they look at organized religion. A lot of people, not everybody, but a lot of people look at organized religion and they say, if you are part of this, I mean, the leaders are hypocrites and the followers are fools. And so, what do you do with that? And so, yes, I love Jesus, but man, these Christians that are are the problem.
What's an example of a fallen leader that you've spent a lot of time thinking about, reflecting on in the church that's happened somewhat recently?
Oh yeah, I mean, so it's a great question. So I mean, there's the Who Killed Mars Hill podcast that kind of came out about 6 months ago or something like that, and that follows Mark Driscoll in the fall of Mars Hill in Seattle, church that was 15,000 members, and then kind of evaporated because of scandal there. And that one, wasn't sexual in nature, but it was power, and it was influence, and it was, it was awful. I highly recommend that podcast. It was put on by Christianity Today, called "Who Killed Mars Hill." That's one example. Then there's Ravi Zacharias, who was an apologist, Christian apologist, who really stood up and talked about how this faith makes the most sense in all of the world, and people kind of sit on the edge of their seats to hear him. He passed away, and then suddenly all these allegations come up about his secret life, and how he was taking advantage sexually of all of these women. And it could go on. Actually, on Sunday, I in the message, I listed out one after another, and then I'm asking, should I go on? And they're like, no.
I mean, it's discouraging.
It's too much. Yeah,
it's so discouraging, and we have to be aware of it. When we sweep it under the rug or pretend like, oh, this can't happen to my pastor, this can't happen to my spiritual leaders. No, it's much more real and common, than we think. Why? Sorry, go ahead.
But I was going to say, you mentioned hypocrisy. I mean, in a sense, I feel like there's hypocrisy in all of us.
Yeah.
I mean, and I don't want to say, hey, I'm a living, walking hypocrite, but I know that there are moments when my behavior can be hypocritical. It's not what I want. It's not what I'm trying to live to. Any time you're trying to live to a standard and you miss that standard, you're not there. You're missing it. But there's a difference between trying not to be hypocritical and then just kind of embracing the hypocrisy, if you will. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, that's important too. So how I sort of ended Sunday was saying, here we are talking about these church leaders, but I hope you all realize you all are church leaders too.
Yeah.
You all are pastors too. Like, this is the priesthood of believers.
Sure.
If our friends and family know we're following Jesus, which if we're doing life correctly, they'll know.
Yeah.
They're going to look to us as an example of Jesus. And so while we might get a ton of grace from Jesus, which we do, no matter how far we fall, no matter how much bad we do, he's waiting with forgiveness and open arms. Other people don't give us that much grace. The margin is so much slimmer.
Yeah.
And so, yes, it's easy for us. So it's like the sermons we preached on Sunday about fallen leaders. It's easy for us to look and judge, and we should be discerning, but also to look inwards that, like, hey, how do I make sure I'm not getting so prideful that I have this huge tumble in my faith, as well, because it can happen to every single one of us.
Absolutely. It's just, it seems like, one of the things I talked about on Sunday is, we've come through a pandemic and that moved to an endemic, whereas now we just expect COVID as part of our life. It's endemic. And I feel like we're at a place where these church scandals and these leadership scandals are endemic. It's just the way it is now. It's what we have to live with, and it's far below what Christ calls us to, and it's not acceptable in any way. But while we as Christians might be like, yeah, we can kind of make sense, and we can say, yeah, that's a bad apple, or that situation is so sad, but it's not the norm. While we say that, the culture, the people out there in the world look at it, and they're not as forgiving.
No, the margin's so much slimmer.
Yeah, and Jesus said that they'll know that we're his followers by our love. Well, they know we're his followers because of our scandal. It's just the worst.
So what do you think, if we're supposed to, so this fall from grace, it can happen to all of us too. So what do you think are some of the key reasons we see all these scandals in the church? Because that'll help us look inwards too, right? If this is the reason that Ravi Zacharias lived a completely terrible hidden life, what's the reason for that? Because that might apply to me too. What were a few of the reasons either you talked about or that you think we can, practically, hey, watch out for this in your life?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that, like in Ravi Zacharias' case, I can only guess what was going through his mind, but I think typically as humans, we do these mental gymnastics, mental and moral gymnastics, and we think, hey, there's a line and it's way out there. and I'm not even close to that line, but we take a little step toward that line, and we justify our thoughts and our behavior, and then we take another little step, and then pretty soon, after 1,000 little steps in that direction, it's only in one last step to cross that line, and then we like, oh my goodness, how did he get way over there?
Yeah.
And it actually was just one step, because it took 1,000 little steps. And so leaders play mental gymnastics too. Spiritual leaders, they're human, and that's not justifying the behavior, but it's just saying that we all have a way of justifying our sin, because in my case it's this, and that kind of thing.
So if you find yourself justifying it, to watch out. One of the things I said, so one of the sayings that's been most impactful for me, something that I've held to, because I don't even remember who said it. That's the funny thing, but this is something I've held to for a long time. Cheating is not one choice. It's 100 tiny choices.
Yeah,
and
sure.
so exactly what you're saying, the decision to cheat on your spouse, or we can apply this to any moral issue. The decision to cheat on your spouse isn't, I slept with another person. It's, I decided to look at another person. I decided to message them. I decided to message them inappropriately. I decided to fantasize about them in my mind. All of these, like you said, tiny little steps approaching the not the unforgivable step, but the one that everyone's going to be, all of these tiny little steps, that eventually pull you so far off path. You're like, what in the world? Where am I?
And any one of those steps, you could have caught yourself and said, wow, I am moving in the wrong direction. Mm-hmm. And it probably, you probably crossed little steps that were too far, but you could have probably saved it at that point and pulled it back. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So if you catch yourself doing mental gymnastics, don't be flexible. Just stop and turn back and get back on the road.
And it's easy to say.
It's easy to say. It's hard to do.
It's hard to do because we fool ourselves. Mm-hmm. And that's where we need other people in our lives to speak into our lives, to call it out even, and say, hey, leadership is a lonely thing oftentimes. And so you need, as a leader, people who you can trust and who can notice when you seem to be who you can be accountable to and can draw you back, recenter you, and that kind of thing. Or you can even share your struggles with. All of those things.
And it's almost people too that you'll listen to them and not just ignore them, because I'll say personally, that's a hard part for leaders who often, I don't feel like I need to rely on anyone. I don't want to. Yeah. But to have that accountability group or people, but then also if they call me out, if they check me and recognize I'm out of line, okay, I'll listen. Even though I might disagree, you might be seeing something in my life, that I don't, because I'm playing these mental gymnastics. And for a lot of leaders, I think this is probably the case in the Mars Hill scenario. That's where pride, your head gets so big that you might have people telling you, hey, watch out. But you might think, oh, I don't have to listen to them.
Yeah, so I want to also be a little bit careful, because the reality is accountability it's kind of a guardrail, but it's a guardrail that we're really good at getting around. Because I can tell you so much and reveal so much, but still find a way to not totally be accountable. And so there's that. So one of the things I talked about a little bit on my message on Sunday was Bill Hybels, and how Bill Hybels had these accusations about him of improper sexual advances towards somebody. Anyway, but the best message I've ever heard on maintaining your spiritual integrity during the long haul ministry was done by Bill Hybels. And one of the things, I know, one of the things that he said was that you should make sure that you don't surround yourself with yes men or yes women, because a yes man or a yes woman will say yes to everything, and they'll never say, hey, no, you need to stop or slow down. They're just trying to please you, and so they'll say yes, and then you're blind, and then you run off the rails. Well, we know Bill Hybels' story, and it's unfortunate, it's sad, and it's heartbreaking, and all of that. But even the person who preached the best sermon ever on that subject,
God was trying to preach to him through himself, and it just, you can Again, say it, but not listen. So I feel like that's a great another takeaway, to have people in your life who will hold you accountable, and then make sure you submit to their accountability as well, that you're not just ignoring them, that you're not, escaping around that. And that's hard. Like, I know nowadays it's hard to be that vulnerable, especially as a leader, because you're worried, will this affect my image? Am I not as good of a leader? I know, I struggle with insecurity. If I'm being as vulnerable as I actually should be, well, then my leadership is called into question,
absolutely.
But it's so necessary to avoid just running off the rails.
Yeah, and it takes humility to say, okay, I think it's this, but all these other people that I'm sitting in front of say, no, it's actually not that, and you need to pull back. It takes tremendous humility to say, okay, I have to trust them in this, even though I feel like everything in me says it's okay or whatever. Then I have to pull back on that. That's a humbling thing to do, but it's critical that we have people who are strong enough to say, hey, here's what I see, and call us out on it.
And it's almost like, too, like we're talking about the many tiny choices before a big bad decision. The people that are good, that hold us accountable, will catch us at that first or second step.
Yeah.
And those aren't huge church scandals.
Right.
Those are the tiny things, just like, hey, I notice you're doing this a little too much. And we're afraid to be vulnerable and out in the open, but we need to avoid it getting to the 10th degree.
Super, super good point, because if we're vulnerable with the things that we feel comfortable being vulnerable with, that's where they will catch it.
Yeah.
And so then we don't have to, be vulnerable about this big scandal because we didn't get there.
Yeah.
Because it was handled at a smaller spot. So thinking about sexual, sexuality and a leader, one of the things that I was told in seminary was that when a leader falls to sexual sin, they think that it's kind of about them, but it's never about them. If somebody is drawn to a spiritual leader sexually for some reason, it's never about the leader. It's about somehow this holy God man that they want to be with. And it's not you that they like. It's this other persona that they're after, which, should be humbling to us.
Yeah.
And, well, I think I'm all that. But no, actually, it's not you at all. It's this other thing which is unhealthy for that person and for you. So.
Yeah, and the devil, I'll say too, being pretty young in ministry, I've noticed that my ministry, the amount that I'm able to pour into other people, to be wise, to how my home life is, affects that. And so I've noticed at least that the devil attacks Megan and I, my wife Megan and I. He'll attack us, not necessarily my ministry, but attack us because the devil knows. I don't know. I think the devil's really smart.
Right.
He knows that if Megan and I are struggling, if I'm not being a good husband, if I'm not being selfless and loving every day, that is going to affect my ministry, And so that's another takeaway, just sort of right in the sermon, just thinking about that. And that a lot of older, wiser people that I know too have warned me, hey, beware that, your ministry will always be a reflection of your home life, because that's where the devil will attack first. And so I think that that's something, even for those of us, whether we're married, whether we're dating, whether we're single, that our interactions with other people, what happens behind closed doors is often where that temptation, that struggle will come from first, because it's the stuff that's easier to hide. Do you mind if we talk a little bit about financial? So I was telling the congregation at Skyrocket, we went over the sort of what we've talked about, the being overly dominant, powerful, and prideful, also the sexual impropriety. What about financial cause for ruin, or financial impropriety as well as a result of fallen leadership?
Yeah, I mean, what about it?
Well, one thing that's, again, I'm just thinking of just all these stories. People always give me as a pastor excuses for why they don't come to church.
Sure.
Because they like me as a person, at least I think, but they're like, well, this is why I just can't get myself to come to church. And one of the big reasons is the church takes in a lot of money, but where does it go?
Well, hold up. I would say, does it really take in a lot of money?
Some of them do. And that's the hard part is I know not necessarily my church. And I could tell them, I was like, our budget is completely public. Come look at our budget and you'll see exactly where it's going.
Right.
But there's other churches where you have pastors that are wearing suits or clothes that are hundreds of dollars. They're living in mansions that are worth millions, flying on private jets. There's a video. I think it's Kenneth Copeland.
Yeah.
Have you seen that video? Him defending his use of a private jet.
His gospel jet.
Yeah, the gospel jet, and talking about how it's crazy. He talks about how if he's flying coach, on a public airplane, that the devil's attacking him, and he can't think his holy thoughts, so that's why he has to fly private. And it's just a load of baloney. And that's like, I understand people who are frustrated with the church that like, here these pastors are making a lot of money, and we're in a struggling community, so why are you giving your money to the church? Tax the church. That's where that impetus comes from too, is that I feel like this frustration with the financial handlings of the church.
So I would suggest that is super rare in terms of, pastors getting overpaid or whatever. And that's a televangelist thing for sure. I mean, you see that almost all televangelists. You also, though, see it like there was part of the scandal had to do with Carl Lentz. He was the pastor of Hillsong, New York. And every time he was on the camera, he had a different pair of $200 shoes or whatever, because he was a sneaker guy, and so there was a lot of questions about that. But for the most part, most churches don't pay their pastors enough to, for that to be the case. But at the same time, maybe I'm taking it a different direction.
Well, and I think so just to jump in, so I think this wasn't a problem 50 years ago. But now most people listen to churches online. And so that's the thing, is we have these big churches where the pastors do make a lot. Whereas maybe 50 years ago, this wasn't wasn't in the public realm, this belief that churches are bad. But if you were to open up TikTok or Snapchat and your friends are liking pastors' posts, most likely it's probably not you or I.
Sure.
It's probably one of the famous church pastors from one of the massive mega churches. They're probably really well dressed. They probably have a mansion. So I think that's partly why this question wasn't applicable, or this fallen way to become a fallen leader wasn't applicable. But it is more and more so now today.
I think it is really applicable, and I think it has to do with who handles the funds at the church. For example, here at our church and at your church too, we don't have access to the books. I mean, well, we have access to the books. We don't have access to the bank accounts. We don't have access to cash. I mean, all of that stuff is handled through our bookkeeper, and we are totally accountable for every dollar, and we're not allowed to overspend our budget and stuff like that. So we have some really good guardrails for us that even if I wanted to take money,
it'd be really hard.
It'd be hard. Yeah. And so it should be hard because again, we play mental games. Humans have a way of justifying things, and you come up with a scripture to justify it, like don't muzzle the ox while it treads out the grain. How about that one? So you're out there working, you should get a little reward along the way. And but at the same time, I don't think that there's anything wrong with a pastor having a nice car or a nice home or a nice pair of shoes, all of that stuff. But then there's the extreme, the gospel
excess,
jet
to not spend in excess. Yeah.
And that's where we point to and we say, well, look at that. And that's that is way the exception. At least in my experience.
Yeah. No, and I think there's a difference. So the passages we were looking at were from King Solomon. He lived life to excess. He had tens of thousands of people working on his palace. He was bringing in, and this is interesting, 1 Kings 10, it says he was bringing in 666 talents of gold per year.
666?
666 talents of gold. And so you can go all the way to the New Testament, the root of all evil, avarice, about how money will often corrupt your heart. But 666, bringing in tons of gold, tons of wealth, to where he was 100% living in excess. So there's a fine line between living maybe a Job-like life where you're blessed by God and you're giving away a lot versus just completely living in a gross excess. And so making sure we don't cross that line even if we are blessed.
So here's a few questions that were asked for us to think about. One question, any common threads on fallen leaders, traits, personalities? Is there anything that you see it's just common?
I think the common thread with everything that we've talked about, and just with everything in general is just pride. And so the ability to submit yourself to accountability, you can't be prideful. Doing all these mental gymnastics, if I have this deep recognition of sin, and that's the hard part, is we preach sin and repentance. But if we're in a church for too long, I grew up in the church. And me as a teenager, I was a judgmental jerk. Like, seriously, I was judgmental. I was like, you can only listen to Christian music. Because I was so holy, if that makes sense. If you're in the church for a long time, the sway is to become prideful. Like the Pharisees, those were the people in the church, and those are the people Jesus wrestles with. So to me, at least, I think, especially when you're in a position of leadership where people are looking at you and following you, if you let it get to your head, if you become prideful, and if you're not very aware of your brokenness and open about it, some people to more degree than others, I think that's how you fall. It all comes down to pride and humility. Yeah. What do you think?
No, I think you're onto it. I think I read an article that talked about the Bathsheba Syndrome, and I can't remember off the top of my head the name of the authors, but it talked about how David was a successful king, and then he took time away. He should have been out fighting, but instead he was back at the castle lounging around, kind of taking some time off when he should have been doing this or that, and you're taking shortcuts, that kind of thing. And I think it really has to do with oftentimes our success, and I say we because I haven't hit that success yet, but whatever. But a lot of times, especially in these big cases, this church leader is so successful that now they can. It starts to get to their head, and they take shortcuts, and they don't do the things that they used to do, and they think, well, here's the exception, and that's oftentimes what leads to that. So, and it has to do with the pride.
Yeah, and there's a difference too. So I was the Bible passage that really came to mind is Jesus washing the disciples' feet.
Yeah.
So he's not submitting to their authority. He's not saying you guys are in charge or whatever. But as he washes their feet, he's saying whoever would be great must be your servant. Whoever would be first must be your slave. So servant leadership, that's something that you've talked about, that we've talked about in our staff a lot. And it goes along with the humility as well as continuing to do the things that got you to where you are, is being an active servant leader. Yeah. Because if you're in servant leadership, that's what will keep you from, I think, going down the wrong path of, fallen leaders.
Yeah, it's good.
Being like Jesus.
So how do we, another question that came in, how do we need to help to protect our leaders? I mean, what can we do to protect our leaders from?
I'll say keep us accountable. Not necessarily in a judgmental way, because we have those people at church too that'll always write the letters, always have a problem. But if you have our best interests at heart as leaders, if you see us slipping, because there's stuff I miss all the time. Like, I'm always worried about that, that somehow, because I haven't lived everyone's life, I don't know everyone's situation. Am I, messing up and saying it this way or in doing it this way, or am I playing mental gymnastics with myself? So make sure it's appropriate, but help keeping leaders accountable. At least for myself, that's one that I think is big. What do you think?
I would say pray for your leaders.
Oh, yeah.
Pray for your pastors, pray for your church leaders, and then use their own words against them. If I preached a sermon and said these words and you throw those same words back at me, then I'm done. I mean,
it's hard to mental gymnastics that, right?
Right.
That's a good one. Use your own words against you. So take notes during the sermon, right?
There you go. All right. So what do you think about, so there's a lot of fallen leaders, and we all fall in some level. One of the funny things that happened at our church Sunday was, as I was talking, one of the questions that was in the back of people's minds that I heard about later was, what's he going to tell us?
What did he do?
What did he do? Is he about to, tell us this is the scandal and I'm so sorry, or whatever, So that was funny. And I didn't do that. So, but that was in the back of their minds, which kept them on the seat. Or
there you go. They're waiting for the end. Oh, that's funny.
Hey, can a fallen leader in church, specifically, a fallen Christian leader, can a fallen Christian leader be restored?
I think that's a hard question.
Yeah.
Because we see a lot of stories of that. We see a lot of stories of these pastors who have scandals, and they go on to another church. A lot of times what happens in the Catholic Church, and there's a lot of justified frustration, is they'll just transfer preach from one diocese to another.
Yeah.
Same with pastors. They'll just transfer them, and it's sort of like a sweeping under the rug. We
saw that with the Southern Baptist Convention too, right? That's part of the scandal that's been in the news lately.
Yeah. This sounds bad or mean. I tend to go on the less grace when it comes to leadership.
Yeah.
Not that a fallen leader can't be redeemed in Christ, because, again, Christ gives us unlimited grace, and I'm a firm believer in that because that's biblical. But as a leader, you're held to a higher standard. And so if there is a large moral failure, to me what that represents is 100 tiny decisions to get there in the mental gymnastics. And that's not something you can sweep away with just 1 year of meditation or a 1 year sabbatical.
Right. Or counseling.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think it has to be the kind of thing where they need to not be in leadership for a very long time. That's just my perspective. But then again, I don't know. What do you think? So I would err on less grace and keep them in the church. I don't think they should be ousted from the church at all. But as a leader, if you have that kind of a fall from grace, like one of these scandals, that you should not be in a position of leadership again, because you've proven with the 100 tiny decisions to get to this place that you might do it again.
Yeah.
You know? I don't know.
Yeah. What do they say? Past behavior is the best predictor of future behavior.
Yeah.
I don't remember who said that, but it was. Can they be restored to leadership? I think yes, I do. But maybe I should say I think it depends. A lot of times it depends on that leader, and what was it that happened? What was done? What was the fall? Some falls are probably you can't restore that leader to leadership on any level again. But again, Christ covers their sin, but it doesn't mean they should be leading. But other falls might not. We probably look at and say, yeah, that was bad, but
it's step 3 or 4, but not 100. Because we're talking about this week. What's the guy's name from Village Church, the big church in Texas? Was that Chandler?
Yeah, Matt Chandler.
Yeah, so that's the kind of thing where I would say maybe we can offer a little bit more grace to him and his perspective. Do you know the story? Do you want to share the story?
I think I know it.
Yeah.
Matt Chandler is he's the president. He's a pastor of Village Church, huge church in Texas, and the president of Acts 29 church planting group. And he's an author, well-known speaker, kind of does the circuit, known really well in the evangelical circles. And correct me if I'm wrong, but as I understand the story, he was approached by somebody who said, "Hey, you're texting one of my friends," and then the story, then it comes out that he had been texting a woman in the church, just a lot.
Yeah,
I mean, multiple times a day, that kind of thing. And he said that it wasn't sexual or romantic in nature, but it was unguarded and unwise. I think those were his.
Not above reproach, not to that higher standard.
Yeah, right. And so his board pulled him out of the church and put him on indefinite leave. And so they're kind of in that moment of, do we restore him? It depends on what he, how he approaches it. Could he be restored? What do you think?
I would say, so at first I was going to bring him up as an example of, hey, we caught him before that, the big failure where he was explicitly cheating on his spouse. But then I have to think he didn't come forward with this impropriety to the board. He got caught. Yeah. This woman's friend was the one that approached him and started bringing it to the light.
Right.
So I would say that's another big distinguishing factor, is that if you're a spiritual leader and you do come forward in vulnerability and saying, hey, I messed up, to me that shows a lot more growth and possibility for restoration of leadership than if you get caught. So I would say I would be more inclined to give Matt Chandler another chance, but then again, he didn't come forward, he got caught.
Yeah.
And so that's I think there's a huge difference in that is did you have the humility to confess, or were you caught?
Yeah, that's a good point. The other thing that he did to add a little bit more context, is when, and you probably know this too, is when that came out, he took it straight to his board and said, here it is, and here's access to my stuff. And so they were
he
able
didn't
to
hide it.
Right.
once it
At that
came out,
point, he was an open book, but he had cross lines, you know.
But that's good. And see, that's another, it's you have to take it by case, is what's the intentions of the person. And he could have maybe tried to talk to this person or handle it privately, but he went straight to the board, which to me is very honorable. And that's it shows good intention that, hey, maybe I did make a mistake and I need help with you holding me accountable. Because that's like what we're talking about, is we need that. It's like, am I doing mental gymnastics here? You know, and that's needed.
Yeah, it's really hard because now he has an asterisk by his name.
Yeah.
You know, now you look at him, you think, but, you know.
But that's even a good thing, too, in a sense. Like Paul, for example, Paul had an asterisk by his name. He was killing Christians. Maybe that should be the model for answering this question. Paul was killing Christians. Was he redeemable? The answer is yes. Like, God redeemed him. And there was an asterisk by his name. You know, the Jews didn't want to necessarily follow him.
Kind of. But the asterisk with Paul was before he came to Christ.
Yes,
and
so that's true. So that is very, very different. Yeah.
But then think about John Mark. Okay, tell us the John Mark piece
in
the Bible.
John Mark.
Okay, so I'll tell it.
I was like, you talking about John?
Yeah. So Mark, not like the Gospel of Mark, but John Mark, who was traveling with Paul and then at some point left Paul. And then Paul wasn't too happy about it. He's like, I don't want anything to do with that stuff. And then later on, we find Paul and John Mark traveling together again, and that's restored kind of thing. But I don't know. Maybe that's not worth telling.
No, I think
I won't tell that story.
No, tell the story. So
that's it.
What I was like, we don't get too much detail in the scripture, right? On whether he left or whether there was something explicit that happened.
Yeah, so can a leader, you know, I think sometimes a leader can be restored because of their giftedness, because of their calling, because falling doesn't mean you've lost your calling. But
write that down. Boom. Falling doesn't mean you lost your calling.
But it doesn't. But you might not be able to lead in the place where you were leading when you fell, because there's a lot of brokenness, a lot of pain, and that kind of thing. And so probably a new context would be appropriate. I don't know. Of course, if you've molested somebody, you know, you've totally disqualified yourself.
There's different degrees.
Yeah, there's things you can do that totally disqualify you from leadership.
Yeah.
In a church like that. All right, good. What else you got on that? Anything?
I've covered well.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. What do you think? Is there anything else that, I don't know, is super, super applicable for us, you know, every single day?
I do.
Yeah.
I think so. One of the questions came in and says, what harm does a fallen leader cause, micro and macro? What harm does a fallen leader cause?
And so that might be another takeaway, is just keeping that in mind. And I'll say my plea too is to be aware of the effect fallen leaders have on those who are not churched and not going to church. And we need to be aware of that harm. It completely taints the reputation of the church. And sadly, it taints the reputation of Jesus.
Yeah.
Because we're his representatives. And it shouldn't be that way. But that's just how it is. And so we need to be aware of that, and we need to be gentle with people who won't come to church because of these issues. We need to be sympathetic to it, because it makes sense. If Christ has changed us, we should be acting differently. But then we have all these examples of leaders not. And so it really does affect the church at a macro level. It prevents people from coming to God, and we need to know that so that we can be strategic and sympathetic in our outreach and evangelism. And
then when a leader falls, the fallout from that leader is just damage. You know, if I looked at that leader and when he or she taught, I felt the presence of God. I heard from God, and now this person falls, and now I'm wondering, wait a minute, was any of that real?
Yeah.
And or they're a liar and they stole money, and now you know, now people have church baggage that they have to work through, or maybe like your friend who looked at it and said, yeah, this just isn't real, because it was a false representation of Christ in that.
Yeah.
Although the words they spoke might have been real all along. That's one of the questions I ask is, did that person's fall from ministry or moral failure, does that invalidate all the good they've done up until that point, or the words that they've spoken, that kind of thing?
And I don't think so. I think something we have to be very intentional to is sticking within the Martin Luther tradition, the Reformed tradition of not having someone between us and God. And so what happens is these leaders, we get propped up onto an elevated platform as better than, yes, we are held to a higher standard, but then there becomes, like you said, this almost holy man, holy woman mentality that these people are almost better than everyone else. They're sort of between God and humans. And we might not explicitly think that, but we do sort of subtly think that, is that we hold these really charismatic people from these mega churches that, wow, they're so holy and they must understand Jesus. And so when they fall, it's like, yeah, well, maybe everything was a lie. Partly what we need to do so that affects people, we need to make sure we're not putting leaders on pedestals. Even if they put themselves on a pedestal, we need to not do that. We don't have priests. We don't have, yes, leaders are intercessors for us in God, but that doesn't put them above us in terms of holiness, if that makes sense.
It does. So by definition, celebrity is going somewhere and people know you, but you don't know them.
Yeah.
So in a sense, even a local pastor in some ways can be a local celebrity, which is really awful.
Yeah.
Because it's not good. But boy, you can sure enjoy that. You can enjoy that status, and finding a way to kind of hate that status is probably the best. Best thing for us, because it'll go to our heads pretty quick.
And being honest too about, hey, these are my words, but that anything that's not of Christ hopefully falls off. You know, we need to be honest as leaders that, you know, don't just believe in Jesus because I'm telling you to, right? Because then if I fall, I don't want you to fall away. Do the digging yourself. You know, encouraging people to be leaders themselves and encouraging them that, hey, this is the priesthood of all believers. Have your own faith. Don't just listen to me tell you, you know, to have a faith. And so that's threatening to a celebrity status pastor, you know, that because celebrities need people's attention. But if we teach people how to become, you know, self-sufficient, thinking for themselves, reading the Bible for themselves, having a relationship with Jesus for themselves, then one of us might have a moral failure, but then their faith is self-sustaining, you know, because they're connected to God. They're not connected to me who's connected to God.
That's really good.
Yeah.
It's like sometimes it might depend on where my faith is when that pastor fell, when that church leader fell, because if my roots are already deep, then I'm not going to be shaken. But if my roots are pretty fresh, it might wipe me out.
Yeah. So spiritual formation is important. To continue that personal growth process.
Good stuff.
Yeah.
Good stuff. Well, hey, hard subject, but man, it's there, isn't it?
Oh yeah. I mean the hard ones are the fun ones to talk about.
Are they?
At least I think so, because these are the ones that, you know, we hear, at least I hear excuses for why I don't come to church. You know, I think it's so important to dive into these hard issues, because it's what Monday Matters is all about. This is the stuff we hear during the week that you don't normally hear at church, but let's dive into this, because what matters on Sunday, what happens on Sunday matters on Monday. And so, it was great talking. I think it's worth talking about.
Yeah. All right. Well, hey, thanks for joining us, and we'll catch you next week on Monday Matters, hopefully on Monday instead of Tuesday.
On Monday next time. There we go.